What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and I felt like covering Neil Gaiman's Eternals. And the reason why is because looking at the trailer that we've seen recently, and really it looks like a lot of the stuff that we're going to see in the movie is going to be based on what Neil Gaiman did in his Eternals run. Now, here's the thing. Neil Gaiman's Eternals is designed to kind of explain why it is that we haven't seen the Eternals for a really long time in Marvel Comics, because this takes place during Civil War, and prior to this point, we really hadn't seen the Eternals for a while. And so it was a really cool way to kind of fold this in. And so what this does is it initially picks up with a guy by the name of Makkari. Now, this guy has what are basically kind of like these flashback memories, these moments where he experiences something from his past, but he's not really sure what it is. And even for him, it seems like kind of a nightmare. Now, this will become important later on down the line when we kind of get like the backstory and everything. But what he's basically having dreams of is the war between the Eternals and the Deviants, and then the arrival of the Celestials in the middle of that war, and what was basically the Great Cataclysm, right? The sinking of Atlantis. And so this is cool because in the middle of all this, he's suddenly met by the arrival of Ikaris. Now, one thing to know is that Ikaris doesn't fully know who he is, right? And that's going to become a major plot point throughout this video, at least this kind of being the first part of the story. We'll cover the second part in the second video. Ikaris doesn't fully know who he is. Makkari doesn't fully know who he is. So a lot of this is really just kind of discovery, right? Now, Ikaris has a much better idea of who he is than Makkari does, but that's why he keeps saying, like, have you ever wondered where humanity came from and different things like that? The reality is that Ikaris looks like a crazy guy, right? He shows up at this dude's hospital first and foremost, like pestering him, talking about, hey man, like, have you ever wondered where everything in existence came from? You ever wonder who made everything that's there? It's what you would expect like a Jehovah's Witness to show up on your doorstep and ask at like 7 o'clock in the morning, right? Are you prepared for the Celestials' return? That kind of a thing. And he even shows up on the guy, like outside the guy's apartment, right? Outside his brownstone in New York, right? Knocking on his window and asking him like, hey, have you thought anything about what I've told you? You know, have you ever wondered about the origins of intelligent life on this planet? It's just kind of crazy stuff. Now, at that point, you switch over to Sersi. And Sersi, of course, is kind of living out this life where she is pretty awesome, right? It's just Sersi doing Sersi stuff. You get this little bit of a tour with regards to these Eternals who are basically here, living out their lives, all the while seemingly completely oblivious of the fact that they are actually Eternals. They don't seem to know who they are. They don't seem to know what they're capable of or what they can do. The closest thing that you really get here is this moment where you kind of have a sort of session between Thena and Ikaris, but it really seems to be just kind of a general discussion between the two. While they do look like Eternals, it almost kind of seems to be a flashback to a degree. And so one of the things that happens is that in the middle of all this, Ikaris is suddenly attacked by these two just guys, right? Look like thugs, that kind of a thing. They will become very important later on in the story. But for right now, they're just a couple of guys who are giving, Ikaris a hard time. In fact, they actually throw him down into a net and then throw a bomb down there with him and then try to blow him up. But at that point, you switch over to Druig, right? Now, Druig at this point in time is really kind of a military / representative of a nation known as Verazeka, I think is how you pronounce it, or Vorazeka. Whatever it is, it's one of the former Soviet countries, right? For those of you guys who aren't really familiar with that, back when you had the USSR, like during and after World War II, you had what was essentially just a whole bunch of smaller countries which had been conquered by the Soviet Union, and they were all just kind of unified under the banner of the USSR. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall and all that kind of stuff, Nikita Khrushchev losing all his power, that what you had, what was basically the Soviet bloc dismantling. And so a lot of those countries that had previously been really ruled by the Soviet Union had now become self-governing. And so in the Marvel Comics, basically Vorazeka is one of those places, right? So in the real world, there were a lot of them that were there, so a lot of them just haven't recovered. But the important thing is that's where this place comes from. Now, the reality of this is, again, much like the other people who are here, Druig does not know who he is. Instead, his working with Sersi is kind of interesting because they've known each other for like 1,000,000 years, but they don't know that they've known each other for 1,000,000 years. And that's why they're talking like strangers. Instead, the idea here is to work with Sersi to actually organize a party that's basically going to be held at the embassy of Vorazeka for the purpose of helping to kind of drum up tourism, to show people this is a place where they want to travel to. It's really geared more towards the rich and the powerful, right? Because when it comes to any organized society, specifically American society, if the rich and the powerful do it, those who are not rich and powerful will likely follow suit in order to appear rich and powerful, or to kind of get a taste of the lives of the rich and the powerful. And so it's a pretty smart move, if only for diplomatic reasons. But following that, you switch over to Makkari, who basically responds to the emergency room call anyway, about this guy who basically is supposed to be blown up. He should be dead, right? This guy's got fractures, he's got, burns and all all kinds of stuff, only to find out that it's Ikaris. You switch over momentarily to Tony Stark to Iron Man as he meets with Thena. Now, Iron Man and Thena have a very lengthy history together, but again, like the other Eternals, Thena doesn't really know who she is. Instead, as she's performing these kind of weapon experiments, creating a bomb that can blind people, things like that, it all comes to her exceedingly easily, because while it is basically in her nature to do it, she doesn't realize it, right? So it's like if you spoke Spanish all your life and then forgot that your ability to learn Spanish would be much, much easier than a person who's never learned Spanish in their life, because what you're doing is basically drawing on your subconscious, right? You're drawing on something you already know. You just don't know that you know it. And so because of this, Thena kind of makes this offhanded remark that it was really, really easy, you know, just like remembering, but this little bit of an exchange will become important later. But switching back over to Ikaris, this is when you get at least a partial spilling of the beans with regards to everything. It's kind of funny the way this happens, because when I was reading through this, I was like, okay, one of two things is happening. Either Ikaris doesn't remember how things were supposed to happen, or Neil Gaiman's messing with us. Neil Gaiman's changing things up. So Ikaris is going to give us the explanation here, but I'm going to kind of fill you in on how things actually are. But right now, the way that Ikaris says this is about somewhere around 1 million years ago that the Celestials had arrived on Earth. Now, for those of you guys who are familiar with all of this, because we have talked about it before, bear with me, because I think a lot of people are going to be seeing this and have no idea what's going on here. About 1 million years before the modern day, the Celestials showed up on Earth. Now, the Celestials visiting Earth was part of a grand cosmic experiment, right? They literally did it across the entirety of the universe. In more recent years, especially during Al Ewing's Ultimates, Marvel sort of shifted up the origins of the Celestials themselves, which it might behoove us to do an updated origins of the Celestials video, just because of the fact that a lot of significant things have changed. What Al Ewing did doesn't really have a bearing on what's happening here, so that's why we'll probably make a separate video. But the important thing is that as the Celestials came into existence, or really entered into this universe, they spread across the whole universe and basically seeded worlds. Now, depending on what story you're talking about, Neil Gaiman's keeping it pretty contained here. One of the things that Marvel's done over the years is introduce the idea that everything that exists in the universe outside of the cosmic entities and Galactus, right? So all the solar systems, all the galaxies, all the planets, stars, all that kind of stuff, that was all created by the Celestials. Other people have said, and other writers have said, that those things just kind of formed naturally as they do in a universe, and all the Celestials did is exactly what you see them doing here, showing up on worlds and seeding it with life. Regardless of how you slice it though, the important thing is that whether the Celestials seeded these worlds with life or life already existed, the Celestials would travel around the universe to different worlds, and they would experiment on the denizens of that world. In the case of Earth, what had happened is the Celestials had basically taken a group called the Wanderers. Now, one of the things that Neil Gaiman is leaving out here, and it's probably pretty intelligent to do this, is that technically if you go and you read the old Jack Kirby Eternal stuff, that it was actually Gaia, the sentience of Earth and the biological mother of Thor, that had led these individuals to the Celestials themselves. But the thing about this is the Celestials basically took a small portion of humanity at the time and they split them into thirds. And then following that, they started modifying their genes. 1/3 of humanity had their genes augmented so they would basically achieve godlike power. And that's where the Eternals came from, the ability to tap into cosmic energies and to essentially do anything they want to, as well as immortality insofar as if their physical body is destroyed, they can be brought back. They can be resurrected, essentially. What you had is the Eternals just kind of created and existing as an absolute number that could never grow beyond the existing number that were created by the Celestials. Now, with the second third of humanity's genes being destabilized, that created the Deviants. The big difference here between the Eternals and the Deviants is that the Eternals all essentially look alike. The Deviants are all completely different. So it'd be like if I took 100 of you guys and I modified your genes and then basically turned each one of you into a different race that was completely and totally different than any of the other races around you. The big kicker to this, and Neil Gaiman doesn't really explain how, somehow they managed to find a way to procreate. Now, because they were able to do that, they spread across the world so fast. Their numbers increased by the millions. Now, Neil Gaiman kind of ends it there and basically says like there was a great big war that broke out between the Eternals and the Deviants and so on and so forth. So let's fill in a few gaps, right? Let's kind of expand this a little bit and offer some more explanation in terms of the things that he doesn't cover here. So one of the things to know is that the last third of humanity had their genes modified so that at some future point in time, they would develop powers. And that's how Marvel explains why it is that Bruce Banner was just like hit with gamma radiation, and instead of becoming this giant mass of irradiated tumors like he did in Marvel Ruins, that instead he becomes the Incredible Hulk. It explains why it is that some kid in a classroom somewhere can go through a heightened level of stress or start entering into puberty, and then suddenly an X gene activates and they're just another mutant out there. Now, because of the fact that humanity, or at least that third of humanity, didn't have powers at that point in time, what it led to was the Deviants essentially subjugating them, right? Conquering them and then turning them into a kind of slave labor. During that time, the war between the Eternals and the Deviants broke out, and the Deviants operated out of the capital city of Lumeria in Atlantis. And so when this giant war took place and the Eternals realized how hopelessly outnumbered they were, that they couldn't continue fighting the Deviants without risking being destroyed themselves, that what they did is they contacted the Celestials, and the Celestials returned, only to find out the Deviants had basically deviated away from the role that was originally created for them by the Celestials. Now, the Eternals did the same thing, right? It wasn't until this war broke out that the Eternals cared about what was going on with humanity. When the Deviants struck first, that's when the Eternals started getting involved. And so what you saw was the Great Cataclysm, the Celestials basically annihilating the Deviants almost to the point of complete and total extinction. They reduced their numbers down to a few thousand, and their population never came back from that. And then in turn, it allowed humanity to flourish, because the Celestials then turned to the Eternals and said, if you basically move away from protecting humanity again, we'll destroy you all, right? We'll wipe everything out. We'll cleanse the whole world and we'll call it a day. Now, this is kind of the explanation of how it all took place, right? This great big conflict that initially unfolded. And so that's why you have Ikaris basically speaking with Makkari and saying your name is actually Makkari. That's your real name here. And the idea is that we as Eternals, once the Deviants were basically defeated and we essentially started following what it was the Celestials told us to do, we started shepherding humanity. We taught them how to grow, how to flourish. We taught them how to plant grain. We taught them how to work with metals. We taught society everything it would need to become productive. And this is the Marvel explanation as to how it is that the capital city of Lumeria in Atlantis and the Earth itself could be such a gigantic, thriving, place, right? With all kinds of trade and commerce and, advanced technologies and things like that. And then after the Great Cataclysm, humanity essentially appeared to start over again, because it did, right? Humanity was pushed to the near brink of extinction. Baseline humans were really the only ones left. The Deviants had basically gone underground. And because humanity had largely been used as a kind of slave labor force, they weren't really properly educated. And so during that time, during this whole era, it really was almost like starting from zero. So it's very Aristotelian, right, in terms of how this whole thing goes down. But with this whole explanation being given to Makkari, he's kind of like, okay, this is crazy talk, right? Like none of what you're telling me makes any sense whatsoever, and it seems absolutely ridiculous. And so what actually ends up happening is a couple guys show up, the same guys that actually tried to blow him up. They seem to show up here, and then of course he's handed over to those guys, with Makkari not really knowing what it is that he's doing. And so during that time, a few things unfold. The first is that Makkari continues to kind of endure these sort of flashbacks to a degree, but while Ikaris is being held captive, he actually telepathically communicates with Makkari, asking him to find a way to free him, to save him, and to get him out of there, because those guys are essentially going to kill him. As far as Sersi goes, while she's there doing her thing at this great big huge party, what you have is actually Druig and a lot of people who are present here, and the whole thing pops off when like these armed terrorists come running in, start attacking the place, snatching up the scientists with the intention of racing off, and so on and so forth. And during that whole time, you actually have what is in effect the formation of a Unimod. Now the Unimod forming here is really kind of a smaller version of what it normally is. And for those of you guys who don't know what that is, the Unimod is something you only ever really see when Eternals come together, due to the fact that like a gigantic decision needs to be made and no one Eternal is equipped to make it on their own. So say for example that like something happened, the Deviants had like overran the world, there was no way for the Eternals to get a hold of the Celestials, and they said, okay, we have to like obliterate the Earth, in order to stop the Deviants from like spreading into the cosmos or something like that. I don't know, I'm just using some example. What would happen here is they would form the Unimind to, one, know whether it was actually the right decision to make, and two, if it were the decision that they made, blood would be on all their hands, because they made it as a singular cohesive unit. And so with that being the case, because this minor Unimind is formed, a handful of things happen. The first is that Makkari realizes he is Makkari, that he can move at hyperspeed. And so following that, what you end up doing is switching over to Iron Man, who basically, appears on the scene, right, in the midst of all this chaos and all this insanity. And the funny thing is that while Sersi has woken up to this idea that there seems to be something going on with her, to a degree realizing what's happening, she doesn't fully grasp it. Instead, what actually ends up happening here is Iron Man takes Sersi to the side, seems to say something to her, and then basically leaves. Now, the reality of this is there are some people here that have powers, but none of them want to act. And the reason why is because most anybody here who has powers is likely unregistered. Remember, this takes place during the events of Civil War, or really in the aftermath of Civil War. Tony Stark's essentially won, he's director of S.H.I.E.L.D., but superhuman registration is still in effect. And so if you are an unregistered superhero, you can either register or you can be thrown into the prison in the negative zone, where you'll just be left to rot, basically. And so because of that, none of these guys really want anybody to know that they have powers. But the crazy thing is, a lot of this is really kind of coming from Makkari, who's basically recounting everything everything that's going on here. And the funny thing about this is that this whole recollection of what's been going on seems to be in the process of being recounted to Sprite. Now, the crazy thing about this is we don't definitively know that it's Sprite, right? In fact, we'll find out a little bit more about that here in a second. But regarding these two guys who had kidnapped Ikaris and are basically torturing him and experimenting on him, you end up finding out that, of course, these guys are Deviants. More so than that, what they're actually doing is they are reading from what's called the Book of Krask. And this is particularly important because what this book says is that, and then the Golden One, the greatest of all the Celestials, he who had created the changing people at time's dawn, he who rose up against his fellows, let my people be, he said, for did I not give them dominion over the earth and all that is upon it? But the other Celestials turned on him and tricked him. They swore to him that they would leave the changing people in peace. They were oath breakers. Then, and thus it is written, the oath of a Celestial is written on the winds of space. And he shone like the sun, but after they betrayed him, he was blacker than tar. They buried him, for they could not kill him. Beneath the earth, our dread Lord lies dreaming, yet all things change. And so what these guys are basically talking about is the dreaming celestial, right? Tiamu or Tiamat. It depends on who you're talking to. I always call him Tiamu, the dreaming celestial. Here's something to understand. This guy is powerful. Tiamu, the dreaming celestial, is on a whole different level than virtually anybody else that you've seen involving the celestials themselves. Like in this hierarchy of celestials, this guy's way beyond them. Now, there are a couple of things that happen here that are worth mentioning, but are not overly important. For example, Druig realizes because he can kind of manipulate the minds of others by basically screwing with their memories or their experiences, tormenting them by their own life history, that what he does is start to realize he could rise through the ranks and actually rule this country that he represents. The second thing that happened is he actually orchestrated the terrorist attack, but instead of simply just kidnapping the scientists, that one of the people that was working alongside him turned against him. So when he visits this guy, he basically tells this guy to kill himself, and that's essentially it. But then you switch over to Thena, who of course is being held as one of the scientists by this, this group, essentially led by Druig himself. And during this whole event where she's being held captive, she suddenly realizes how deadly she is, right? That she can use anything as a weapon because she's the most prodigious fighter of all the Eternals. It's the reason why in Marvel Comics, in the early days of humanity, during the days of like Greek gods and all that kind of stuff, Thena was oftentimes considered to be the earthly embodiment of Athena, right? The Greek goddess of conflict or war or wisdom or whatever it is that she was known for. But the important thing is that Thena immediately starts realizing on who she is, right? Okay, so like I'm Thena, I'm an Eternal, I'm basically the best fighter of all the Eternals. So she immediately contacts Tony Stark, knowing who he is. And she's like, can you home in on this number? He's like, yeah. She's like, get here as fast as you can. So he basically races over there, takes all these guys out, gets a hold of Thena, and then basically flies off. Ikaris, after having essentially been killed, is properly resurrected. And so now that he's properly resurrected, the actual resurrection process takes place insofar as all his memories of everything are restored to him. Now, that's an important thing that happens when it comes to the Eternals. It's something that Kieran Gillen's modified a little bit in recent years during his Eternals run. But the important thing here is that when an Eternal dies, when they're resurrected and they're brought back, they're a clean slate. You can put anything in their brains that you want to, right? Like Ikaris could come back and the machine could be like, actually, you're the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man, and we need you to go attack New York, right? And he would believe it, right? Because he's basically a shell, right? It's like pouring water into a cup, right? Whatever you pour into that cup, that's what that cup will be. A cup of milk, a cup of water, a cup of tea. And so because of this, it's a very, very interesting process, but potentially also a dangerous one. The benefit here is that every ounce of knowledge, every experience that the Eternals have is backed up. It's actually what Jonathan Hickman essentially copied when it came to Krakoa in the X-Men comics, right? The fact that the X-Men back up everything that had happened to every mutant across the world so long as they've been to Krakoa, so that if they happen to be resurrected, they have their memories up until that point. They can be changed and modified, but they're basically the same thing. That's what's happening with Ikaris. His memories are being restored to him. And so as Makkari is spending time talking to this little kid, the first thing he asks is like, are you an Eternal, right? And this kid's like, no, I'm not an Eternal. I promise you, like, I am not an Eternal. I'm a human, right? Like, I'm a human person. I have no powers, no abilities whatsoever, which really begs the question, how does he know so much about the Eternals? Because he tells Makkari, like, touch that black rock over there, right? We'll find out if you're an Eternal or not. Touch that black rock and we'll see what happens. When he touches that rock, immediately this doorway opens and basically lowers them down into this kind of, basement type area underground in San Francisco. And as this kid talks to him, right, he's kind of like, okay, so here's the thing. The next test of whether or not you're an Eternal is to attack that giant black wall over there, right? Like, charge that thing as fast as you can. He's like, for me, I don't do anything if I try to charge it, but you charge it and let's see what happens. And so like when Makkari goes to hit the wall, before he can even touch it, he's kind of pushed back by this sort of energy field, and then is unable to actually do anything to the rock. And that's when this kid starts messing with him, and he's like, God, you guys are such idiots. Like, that is not a giant black rock. That's the Dreaming Celestial, right? That's how big the Dreaming Celestial is. This guy's miles tall. But what this kid reveals is that he is actually Sprite. And the reason why the Eternals can't remember anything is because of what Sprite did. That when the Celestial showed up on Earth in the early days, right, like 1,000,000 years ago, and they modified the genes of 1/3 of humanity and made them Eternals, one of them was Sprite. That he was a kid whose genes were modified and he was given godlike powers. The issue with this is that by and large with the Eternals, their evolution is frozen in place. They'll never grow, right? They'll never get older. They are, by all standards of measurement, immortal and perfect. And so the biggest issue that Sprite had with this is he will never age. What really pissed him off is that apparently like Sersi has just like banged everybody, right? He's like, yeah, man, like every single like Eternal dude she's slept with somewhere along the line. He's like, but she'll never sleep with me because I'm like 11. He even approached her at one point and tried to see if she wanted to knock boots. And she was like, no, I mean, you're 11. That's not going to happen. And so ultimately that combined with the fact that he's been 11 years old for 1,000,000 years was enough for him to just not want to have anything to do with this. The only thing he could really do was find enjoyment in messing with people, right? So like showing up to a guy in 1901 out on a park bench and claiming to be Peter Pan, and actually setting the stage for the story that became Peter Pan, right? The character of Peter Pan in literature is based off of Sprite basically messing with a guy, right? All that kind of stuff. And so the idea here of Sprite was to essentially strip down and to eliminate the possibility of Eternals being what they are and to actually revert them back to humans. But that's not something you can easily do. If Sprite had kind of jumped into a campaign using his ability to create illusions and said, actually, we're all humans, and called it a day, it never would have worked. Instead, what happened here is that there was a scenario where a Unimind was formed and Sprite was part of it, right? It was necessary for Sprite to be a part of this Unimind in order to basically fix, the aftermath of this giant earthquake and so on and so forth. The important thing here is that Sprite realized, given the power of the Unimind, because it can alter the genetic structure, the memories, the whole 9 yards of Eternals, he can use that to his own ends. And so over the course of years, and we're not really given a definitive amount of time, we're told that it's like thousands and thousands of years, that what he did is he actually began to manipulate the Eternals. So when an Eternal died and they were brought back, he would make a modification to their memories here. That when another Eternal died and they were brought back, he'd make a modification there. If they die and come back enough times, suddenly this entire memory bank that they have, right, everything they recall is full of false memories. And that's what he says. He's like, in 100 years, there's a lot of illusion that you can create. You can give people memories that aren't theirs. You can make them forget things they always knew. You can make people forget things that are true and believe things that are not. A little illusion goes such a long way. He says it took a whole lot of work, and he's talking about more work than he ever would have believed to have been possible. But he said, when I was done, I went down to the reactivation chamber. I took Zuras, the most powerful of us, Ajak, the only one who could talk to the Celestials, and I brought them here. I couldn't make the archive reactivate them fully without bringing back all the frozen dead, but it was enough. What he did here is he basically took Zuras and he took Ajak, he brought them here to the Dreaming Celestial, and then he performed a Unimind using those two Eternals and the Dreaming Celestial, which basically gave him the power to do anything he wanted to. And that's one of the things he says, like, I could have done anything I wanted to. I could have made snow taste like chocolate, right? I could have made the rivers run red. I could have done anything that I wanted to in existence, but the only thing I ever wanted to do was to be human. And so using the power of the Dreaming Celestial, he essentially stripped away the Eternals' knowledge of who they were and then reduced them down to being humans. And so that's one of the crazy things here, is that because of that, everything that's happening here has all been done at the hands of Sprite, the greatest ruse that Sprite's ever done. More so than that, what you actually end up doing is switching over to Ikaris when he goes to see Thena. And once Thena begins to really understand who she is, all these memories of her actual life as an Eternal start flooding back. She's met by the arrival of Ikaris. And he's like, he just kind of hangs there for a second, and then he's like, do you know who I am? And she says, yes. And he says, we have to go now. And when she asks where, he says, it's the Deviants. They're going to wake the Dreaming Celestial, and if they do, they will kill the world. And they will. When the Dreaming Celestial, or if the Dreaming Celestial ever were to wake up, and it does, things are crazy. To give you guys a little bit of a taste of what we're going to cover in this next video, when the Dreaming Celestial wakes up, there's one line in the comic where it says that like the universe shakes in a way that it hasn't done in millions of years, and for the first time in a long time, Galactus knows what it's like to feel fear. It's crazy, right? It's absolutely awesome. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.